East meets West is not a new phenomenon. East has been meeting West since the beginning of recorded history. Assistant Professor Michael Scott of Warwick University explained that we now think even the Greeks, ancient Chinese and Romans lived in a globalized world. Michael Scott, I can't believe we haven't had you on the show yet. You're hard to book.
Great pleasure to be here.
You're hard to book, buddy, I've got to say. You are obviously famous doing so much work on the classical world, but your new stuff's particularly interesting because it is talking about something that when I was little, I was told didn't exist. And that's proper pan-Eurasian cultural trade, material culture links way back in the ancient world period.
Yeah, as you say, I started off working in the Mediterranean, with the Greeks and Romans, the good classical world. But every time I was trying to get to the bottom of a particular site or location, things kept popping up going, hey, you're not going to understand this place unless you look over here or over here or over there. And you came to the conclusion that really you can't understand the Mediterranean without thinking about what's outside the Mediterranean. And that got me thinking about, what is, if you go east, what happens? And there's a sad fact in a way that in UK universities, in history faculties, 93% of staff work on Europe or the West. Right? So very few people in the UK do that looking east in any kind of specialised way. And obviously when you think about the trade that runs from the Mediterranean all the way through to China, you think about the Silk Roads. Now their heyday was kind of way outside my period, much later. For me, that's kind of modern history. But in my world, I'm interested in kind of how did it begin? Right? What were the first tiny tentacles of contact and interaction that were slowly built upon, that would go on to create these throbbing arteries of trade and commerce and exchange of ideas and of peoples that connected the Med to China and changed the world as we know it.
I was brought up to think of the Mediterranean world. First of all, how annoying is it when people say the Roman Empire conquered the world? Does that drive you insane?
What drives me insane at the moment is the new ITV2 show Bromance,
okay.
right? So when this is a show where they've got a bunch of lads, fit-looking lads and their girlfriends to dress up as Roman gladiators, and they've put them in a fake Roman set, and they're getting them to compete against one another for the ultimate gladiator, right? And the production material that went out associated with this show actually said, you know what? Rome's greatest legacy may well turn out to be bromance.
Oh my gosh.
Right? At which point you start going, look, I'm dying a little inside here. No, I mean, the Roman Empire, everyone looks at the Roman Empire, and there's been that recent controversy on Twitter that exploded as a result of a BBC cartoon that showed a Roman centurion in Roman Britain who might have dark skin. People don't think about the Roman Empire as covering so many continents and worlds and of there being such a hodgepodge, a mix of populations and peoples. But that wasn't just happening in the Mediterranean. From the 1st century BC onwards, you have lots of peoples that are moving and making their way backwards and forwards across, from the Mediterranean to China and in all the different cultures in between. And it's from that era, really, from the 1st century BC, kind of that you start to get these tentacles of interconnection really appearing.
So what happens in the 1st century BC that facilitates those links?
Two big pushes, one from the west, one from the east. Right? In the west, you see the turn of the Romans from their republic to empire, and you see their expansion into what we now call the Middle East and Western Asia. But also from the Chinese side, you see a massive expansion westwards as they seek to stabilize their authority, fight back against the nomadic tribes that have been plaguing them for centuries, and particularly get access to horses for China and for particularly the Emperor China. It was absolutely crucial to have really good horses that was changing the nature of warfare in China at the time. And the best were coming from Central Asia, these so-called blood-sweating horses that the Chinese were just desperate to get hold of.
And that's the long strip of grassland that basically joins northwestern China to the Black Sea, is it? This sort of swathe of pasture.
Going through the states of what was then known as a Fergana, and kind of in Parthia, and kind of all of these sorts of places. And it's from those initial kind of pushes, west and east. and also the migrations of nomadic tribes that were sent cascading westwards as a result of China moving westwards, that you start to get these first kind of these meetings, these clash points. And one of my favorites is in modern-day Afghanistan, right? The ancient capital of, well, the ancient state of Bactria, Greco-Bactria. There was a city called Iconium that was a beautifully lavish, expensive city. And we know that towards the end of the 2nd century BC, beginning of the 1st century BC, it was taken over by nomadic tribes that had once existed on China's borders in the east and had actually been forced to migrate all the way into Central Asia. And it's from these moments, these migrations of tribes, these initial kind of military pushes, and then followed up by diplomatic missions. The Chinese were brilliant at sending these very long, 10, 12, 15-year long diplomatic missions to find out about what was happening in Central Asia and in the West.
So let's start with, what did the Mediterranean basin, the Greeks and Romans, know about the Chinese around about the start of the empire, first century AD?
You know what they call it? They call it the land of the Seres, the land of the silk people. And it's known and understood because of their most famous product, silk, right, which is making its way into the Roman world, so that by the 1st century BC, Pliny is spending a huge amount of time complaining bitterly about the moral degradation that has happened in Rome because of Romans' love of this silk, this stuff. It's like, it's this disgusting, near see-through clothing that women are adorning themselves with, and even men are starting to wear, he kind of goes on about. And it's completely sapping the moral kind of virtue of the Roman people. And he's particularly exercised about this, their gold supply. Right? He's seeing massive amounts of gold just going east from the Roman Empire. And we know that's true, right? If you excavate in India today, you will no doubt, kind of particularly on the west coast of India, find absolutely hordes of Roman coins. Right? Because by the 1st century AD, certainly, the Romans were sailing all the way to the west coast of India and trading in a constant kind of a buzz of trade with all the stuff, getting the stuff there on the west coast of India that was coming all the way from China.
And because Trajan reaches, does he, so what is now Kuwait? I mean, did the Romans have a presence? Of course they had a presence on the Red Sea, but the Persian Gulf as well.
So the trading boats, absolutely, are kind of plying backwards and forwards. You know, there's this wonderful text called the sort of the Periplus, when at the moment when they discover how to ride the monsoon winds that take them to India and back within a set amount of time to sort of kind of bring down the cost and expense and uncertainty of the voyage. And we know that kind of the Romans also got round to the east coast of India, and we know that they might have got even further. I mean, there is a hint in the Chinese texts in the 2nd century AD that a Roman embassy, or people claiming to be a Roman embassy, rock up in kind of Vietnam, and they present gifts. But they're presenting gifts of tortoiseshell and rhinoceros horn, and frankly, the Chinese look at this stuff and go, this is a bit shit. You know, we've been led to believe that you Romans over there, who the Chinese really thought about as their kind of equal, that their name for the Roman Empire was Datsin, which is basically means the same as us over there. And they thought about the Romans as, you know, they write in the text saying they're as tall as us, and you know they're similar. We're similar kind of worlds. And then these guys turn up with rhinoceros horn and tortoiseshell, and they were like, come on, guys. We thought you were all about the gold. We thought you were all about the precious stones, you know, the coral, kind of the blown glass, all these things that we'd heard so much about. This is frankly rubbish. And they sent them packing. And you just wonder, it's kind of one of those wonderful what-if moments in history. Kind of, if those guys had turned up with something really exceptional, kind of, what would history look like as a result? If they'd gone, wow, you know, let's have a proper embassy. Let's have a proper kind of, exchange of gifts and diplomatic exchanges kind of carrying on a more regular basis. We could be looking at a very different kind of nature of the world.
So why do I know this story? Because why is Marco Polo extraordinarily celebrated and left behind us? The Romans are a very literate people. My very patchy knowledge of Roman literature is it's people sitting around within that Mediterranean basin, talking about history, talking about politics, talking about theatre. Why are there no celebrated voyage, writers who came back saying, I've just been to the west coast of India, it's amazing?
I mean, on the one hand, there are, But on the other hand, it never happens in the way that it does kind of with Marco Polo, who makes the journey all the way himself from A to B, right? You have to think about the ancient Silk Roads as being traversed by groups of people who do certain distances on it. It's like a relay race, if you like. The goods get transported out of China or wherever they're coming from. A certain group of traders will transport them so far. Then they're sold and bartered in the markets. Then they're transported another distance by another group of people. Then another distance by another group of people until they end up on the sort of west coast of India, whereby then the Roman traders will buy and barter them and take them back home. There aren't people who are going all the way, individuals are going all the way from A to B and back again. The Chinese make an effort to do so at one point. They set off with the mission to get to the Romans. And rather brilliantly, and this tells you everything you need to know about how little the world has changed since the ancient times, they get to the last great empire before the Romans, the Parthians. And the Parthians go, you know what, guys, it's a really long way to Rome. I wouldn't bother if I were you. And they buy the story and they turn around and they go back home again, because the Parthians loved being these middlemen, if you like. They made their living out of being the middlemen, helping the goods transport slowly from stage to stage to stage across this vast, canvas and landscape. So you don't get those kind of dramatic voyaging stories. What you get is people who are operating within their little spheres of their little worlds, their little spheres of influence that they know and understand. But across those spheres, goods are moving these vast, incredible distances.
And even within that was it something that were these journeys still sufficiently dangerous that sort of the kind of people who are writing would be unwilling to go on them, or have we just got a patchy written record and we just don't? I mean, are there going to be other wonderful sources that perhaps we don't have?
I think there's tons of stuff still to find, first off, because a lot of the places that we'd love to be excavating are not exactly in the most accessible or welcoming parts of the world right now. And the bits that have come up are tantalizing glimpses into how well organized this world was. So if you go to sort of the Jade Gates of China, sort of Danang, there are documents surviving there which show that the Chinese were issuing visitor passes to all the traders, that they could walk along, only travel along very specific routes, and they had to present these passes at regular basis. We also from there have letters that were supposed to make their way back west but never did. So there are wonderful letters that were supposed to head to Samarkand for the Sogdian traders that talk about some of the destruction going on in China in the early 4th century that have got stuck in the postal service somewhere and we've picked up. There are documents from some of the intermediary states like in Khotan that have survived. So we can get glimpses of this world. But what we don't have is that kind of buccaneer traveller diary of one person who did it all.
And why is it that this story wasn't told to us when we were kids? Why did we grow up with this idea of quite distinct spheres of independent sort of imperial construction on either end of the Eurasian landmass?
I think it's a lot to do with the cycles of how we tell history, right? How we actually do history. I mean, as you're very well aware, the way we decide to tell history tells us as much about us as it does about the past. And it hasn't always been the case that we've liked these kind of separated units. If you go back to Sir Walter Raleigh, there he was sitting imprisoned in the Tower of London, and after he'd sort of spent a bit of time trying to make chemical explosions happen in some kind of glass outhouse at the back of the tower, he turned to writing history. And what did he write? He wrote a history of the world, and he got through the first kind of 2 volumes of it, and it was supposed to be the big picture. And if you think about it, that was a moment in time in the world when people's eyes were up on the big horizon. This was an era of discovery. This was America's, Australia, everyone coming on the map for the first time. You needed the big picture to be able to understand the world. Dial forward a century or two, and suddenly you've got the rise of the nation state. Actually, history gets repurposed towards defining and underlining the reality of these boundaries that are being drawn around particular areas. Suddenly we want our history in bite-sized chunks. And that's the way it is still now taught in schools. I mean, I remember being in school and our history master saying, right guys, the way we're going to do this is you've just got to imagine that we're getting in a spaceship and we're landing in X place, and we're going to learn a little bit about it, and then we're going to get back in this spaceship, and we're going to go over and learn a little bit about Y. And frankly, how they connect together is not your concern. And I think that is still the way. There's a lot invested in that idea of compartmentalization and specialization. It's the way departments of universities are made up. It's the way kind of you become a specialist in a particular thing. And running counter to that, since the First and Second World War, has been a renewed interest in global history, provoked not least by the idea that if we knew a little bit more about one another, perhaps we'd be less likely to start fighting one another. And so since the World War I and World War II, there has been this growing interest in global history again that I think is exploding right now. Once again, we're in an era of globalization, technological globalization, as well as real-life globalization. And we once again want to have our eyes slightly kind of on the bigger picture. But that's constantly being threatened by things that are going to send us running back to focus on our own world again. I mean, when Brexit happened, I remember one newspaper described it as a rejection of globalization, as if we can check out of the globalized world in which we live. You look at the French national elections recently, the American national elections, all of those have been about, do we want a country that looks outwards and engages outwards, or do we actually want to focus inwards on ourselves and disengage from the rest of the world? So there's a constant balance between these two kind of competing ideas, and we can never take for granted that we're going to remember how much we owe to interaction with one another, and we have to keep investigating and understanding that story of how much in our past we've owed to interaction with one another in order to be able to, I think, prepare people for the global future that almost inevitably awaits them.
It's funny though, because I completely agree with that, obviously, but and what's fascinating about the Roman Empire is that the Roman imperial story, if you want to see it as a sort of European story, first of all, it completely underestimates the importance of the East and to the wealth of the Romans and all that. But secondly, suddenly enter stage right come these nomadic tribes like the Huns and other people who just crash into the Western, well, both sides of the empire and cause fatal damage to parts of it. So there's already a hugely important world history thing going on even then with the collapse and fall of the Western Empire, isn't it? I mean, that's Asian tribes and the domino effect of those tribes heading west is vital to understand how the empire.
It is, and that keeps coming back in different periods of history all the way through time, right to the modern day. So, I think it is absolutely crucial that we start to rethink the way that we study and teach history. And one of the things I do based at Warwick is, I sit in a department of classics and ancient history, but I'm now working with the Department of History and with their Global History and Culture Centre, and this new research project that I'm doing kind of under the auspices of Leverhulme, but I'm also designing an undergraduate teaching module that does kind of this ancient global history story. And we're also developing a new portal called oiko.world that is a map and a timeline that allows people to go and discover and find out about the connections between different ancient cultures from the Med to China. Because I think it's a story we need to know more about. It's quite a frightening story to get into, because how do you start thinking and studying about everything? How do you find your way through that? How do you compartmentalize in a different way? How do you prioritize what you should be studying? All of these are real questions and issues that we need to spend a bit more time thinking about.
So speaking of globalization, how multi-ethnic do you think 5th century BC Athens was, or 1st century Rome, or even 1st century London? I mean, what did it look like?
If you think in Athens, what are we looking at? Even 5th century BC Athens, we're looking at a male citizen population at its height of about 50,000 men, probably a total population, if you include women, children and slaves, around the 200,000 mark. So not a big place. But even within that, you have to expect quite significant, I think, variation of people's, certainly not in the male citizen category, but in the slaves, for instance, could be coming from anywhere around the Athenian Empire, around the Eastern Mediterranean. We know that the police force in Athens, if there was one, was actually a bunch of Scythian archers that were kind of running around. Absolutely, right, kind of coming through, So variety and trade, absolutely. And we know, for instance, that they were in the port of ancient Athens, in the Piraeus, they were officially granting requests from traders to have religious spaces for gods from elsewhere. So we know that Isis was worshipped in the port of Piraeus in Athens because Egyptian traders were turning up there and saying, look, we're regularly here. We'd really like to have somewhere to be able to worship our gods. So we know that kind of thing was happening in Athens. And if you go to more kind of international sanctuaries like the island of Delos, the great sanctuary of Apollo and Artemis on Delos, that was a complete smorgasbord of religions, kind of Syrian deities, Egyptian deities, Greek and Roman deities. There was a synagogue there. It was a complete free-for-all. Not quite, but a real hodgepodge. If you go to Rome, I mean, you multiply that up by a factor of 10, perhaps. Here's a city of 1 million people plus coming from all over the empire and beyond in terms of people trading and going back home. So you have to imagine kind of cultures, religions, ways of living, ways of thinking, languages just absolutely cheek by jowl in the streets.
Was there, if you read the ancient Roman authors, was there sort of racism? Was there an awareness of race and skin colour, or did it matter more your social position and whether or not you're a Roman citizen or not?
Well, I mean, the definition of who is a Roman citizen, who is not, expands gradually until at one point everyone who's in the Roman world becomes a Roman citizen, kind of, at least the men. But certainly not there isn't the understanding of race in the same way that we have it today. There is a definition of where you come from in the world. And that has certain connotations associated with it about how civilized or how barbarian you might be, but there is not kind of the same matrix that we impose today, just like there wasn't the same matrix vis-a-vis sexuality.
So okay, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because it's whereas unfortunately by the 19th centuries you did end up with this kind of weird overlay of white Europeans had been through an industrial and scientific revolution that to an outsider could have been mistaken for kind of racial superiority. Whereas back in the Romans, I mean, a Syrian could be far less of a barbarian than a wild Irishman, for example.
Yeah. I mean, so in that sense, we know of a number of Roman emperors, for instance, that are coming from the coast of North Africa. Lots coming from nowadays the Balkans, from what is now the area of Serbia, etc. So there isn't a sort of one place that the creme de la creme elites come from in the same way. There are obviously families that go back, the old kind of aristocracy elites, if you like, that do kind of dominate in Rome. But then after the 4th century, when Constantinople becomes the new capital of the empire, kind of bestraddling Europe and Asia, you have to imagine that kind of intermixing kind of only kind of increased even further.
What happens? So was it continuity or change? When the Chinese are sort of beginning to forge these links with intermediate kingdoms and the Romans, and then does this continue? Does after your period? I won't make you go too far. Is there a retreat globalization, or actually should we now see the world as almost it's just a continuing energy and exchange across Eurasia, or were there periods when it really got damped down?
There are periods when trade and interconnection in particular areas of the world damps down. So I mean, the Silk Roads are the key trading highways, if you like, until the kind of 15th century, when suddenly you've got the ability to go to America and the seaways are being discovered that cuts out the landways, and then basically the Silk Roads start to die away, a slow death, to be brought back now in the 21st century with China's new One Belt, One Road policy. Right? A train that left China 14 days previously recently rocked up in Britain. You can now, they are investing huge amounts of money to put the infrastructure in place to allow that connectivity to thrive once again. From my perspective, that kind of interconnection is an innate part of humanity, going back to kind of the various earliest phases of what makes us us. It just, I think, pops up or flourishes in different parts of the world at different times for all sorts of geopolitical reasons.
It's funny how we take what we want from the classical world. Now we're taking lessons on globalization and multiculturalism, whereas previous generations took lessons on militarism or rule or imperialism or even republicanism. It must be so interesting for you seeing what people, when they pass the sweet shop of the ancient world, what they choose, what they stop and choose?
It is fascinating. It's great because it shows, I think, on a continuous basis, quite how much the ancient world has to offer. And when someone sits there and goes like, "Oh, it's all ancient history, isn't it?" You go, "Well, no, actually, here is a set of very sophisticated communities that dealt with a lot of the same problems in different kind of ways, often that we still have to deal with today. And we can look at the way that they decided to do things, and we can look at the decisions they made, and the more we look at that and understand that, I think the better prepared we are to then go on and make our own decisions. What was it that Winston Churchill said? The further you can look back, the further you can look forward. And I think in that sense, the ancient world is always going to have something to tell us and show us. Whether we listen to that is an entirely different kettle of fish. And I was reading an article the other day thinking about democracy, one of the other great kind of lessons from the ancient past. And it was saying that in a recent survey, the statistic had been brought forward that only 25% of people in the UK and the US who were born in the 1980s, that's my generation, kind of believed that democracy is essential for the way that we want to live. Only 25%? Kind of, actually, have we forgotten some of the lessons that we thought the ancient world had taught us? Do we need to retune and rethink what we value today, and how can the ancient world play a role in that?
Let's talk like what you've raised democracy. I think that's so interesting. What the democracy we have today is quite different from democracy that the ancient world is. What are the lessons that you like to point out to people about our democratic? What are the lessons that you like to point out about the ancient world's use of democracy that offer us the best lessons today?
You're absolutely right to point at the differences. We talked about ancient Athens being at its height. 50,000 men were the ones who had the political voice, right, who actually met on the assembly and made these democratic decisions. 50,000 people compared to a UK population of 70 plus million. How can you possibly compare and contrast those two systems? And in fact, would we want the kind of direct democracy they had where they got to vote on every issue? The last time we did that was the Brexit referendum. Maybe we don't want that kind of direct democracy on too regular a basis. But on the other hand, I think there is something that we can learn to tackle, or as part of our efforts to tackle the voter apathy that we are now confronted with. We're seeing perhaps changes in that the younger generation, the most recent elections, we've seen higher voter turnout, particularly in this last general election, than in previous years. But it is still woefully low. People not believing that voting and the political system they are voting for has actually that much to do with their real day-to-day lives. And to counter that, we need to find a way of re-engaging people more directly in the process. And a lot of people talk about that being a lesson to take from the ancient world, and coupled with the possibilities of modern technology. So, Barack Obama's talked about this, the need to create a kind of virtual public square where we can once again discuss, kind of things directly, as the ancient Athenians would have done in their smaller community, but do it on a much grander scale.
I always ask classes like this. What can you put down the dynamism and energy of 5th century BC Athens to its democratic process? Were those rowers pulling harder because they knew they had a vote in the assembly?
A lot of people argue that, right? That particularly after 480 and 479 BC, which were the great battles of Salamis and Plataea, when the Greeks, and particularly the Athenians, beat back the invading Persian Empire. The reason they won the Battle of Salamis was because of their ships, their triremes. It was a sea battle, and who was rowing those triremes but the ordinary Joe Bloggs of ancient Athens, and that sense that it wasn't the rich cavalry, those that could afford the horses and the armour, the elites who had defended the city. It was actually Joe Bloggs and his mates. Is often seen as a massive spur towards pushing through what we then now recognise as Athenian democracy. These guys have a right to have a say in how the place is run because actually they do defend the city just as everyone else does. What gives it its dynamism and energy? I think that does have a lot to do with that sense of constant discussion and engagement. The the fact I always find amazing about ancient Athens is that 2/3 of the male citizens would have served on Athens's top governing council at least once in their lifetime. 2/3 of the population would have experience of the top level of government. The equivalent
by lottery, wasn't it?
yeah, absolutely, completely by lot, and you could only serve twice, and you only serve for a year, right? So, throughout your lifetime, imagine the idea that 2/3 of the UK population had worked in Downing Street, right? I mean, kind of that sense of engagement, that sense of being part of the system, of understanding how it works, of having some knowledge of the way that the discussions took place and of the sorts of interests that you needed to balance out in the decisions you were going to make, meant that everyone had an opinion. And it was actually often, quite an interesting opinion. And the thing I love when you look at the inscriptions that survived on stone from Athens that particularly recalled the decrees and the laws that were passed by the Democratic Assembly, they always include a name of somebody who put forward the motion. Right? And they are not kind of the same people time after time. They're not the career politicians that we kind of get saddled with today. They are not the same people directing the fate of Athens. They are people we have never heard of. They are Joe Bloggs and his mate who actually stood up and proposed a motion and an idea that was carried in the Assembly of Athens and adopted and became law and was enacted upon. And I think that's utterly fantastic as an idea. Obviously, we have all the problems associated with the fact that it's men and not women as well being citizens, and this is an entire culture based on slavery, which is giving all these people the time to sit around and chat and talk about all this kind of stuff. But fundamentally, it is a wonderful idea and a wonderful notion.
So what's percentage of the Athenian population? We're going deep dive on Athenian democracy, I'm sorry about this, but what percentage of the population do you think would have attended the assembly?
So, if we're talking about the height of Athens, 50,000 men, we hit a snag quite quickly that when you look at the assembly place, the Pnyx, and you measure it out, and there's all sorts of measurement calculations dependent upon how much space does an individual take up and how many can you squeeze into a box. But most kind of come out with the fact that you couldn't really get more than about 6,000 people on the assembly. So we're talking just over 10% of the population for any one meeting. But if you think about it, these are those 50,000 men are going to be spread out. They're not just within the city of Athens. They're spread out across the state of Attica. To travel in from the furthest reaches of Attica to the assembly in Athens, that's a day lost out in the fields to get there, a day of business, maybe two, and a day to get back. Actually going in for people who live at the furthest reaches is a real investment of time and effort. So yes, on a regular basis, we're talking about probably a little bit over 10%, 10-15% of the total possible voting population that are engaged at any one time.
But you said that you tell us that the Pnyx was packed, for example, so we know that there would have been that many.
Yeah, so we hear both that it was packed, and then at other periods of democracy that there was rather a lot of reluctance, and there's a joke made in Aristophanes, the comedy, that they used to dip ropes in red paint and sort of and run with the ropes around the agora, the market space, and try and hoard people up to the assembly. And you didn't want to get your clothes covered in red paint to show that you were a reluctant one hanging towards the back. So we see both kind of ends of the spectrum at different points in Athens' history. The crucial thing I always think to remember is that when people were there on the assembly voting on issues, they were not, and particularly if it was to do with a military issue, whether or not to go to war, they were not voting to then go and send a professional army to go off and fight on their behalf. They were voting to then go home, if they'd voted for war, pick up their armour and go and fight. So if one could transport back in time to sort of stand on the assembly and to feel the weight and the seriousness with which the decisions were being discussed and chewed over and voted for, alongside all, of course, the grandstanding and the politicking. And we know that there were people who were better at talking to the people and better at convincing the people than others, the great orators of their day. All of that must have created an extraordinary atmosphere to be a part of.
When you are describing the ancient world, I feel like it's a very familiar place. And yet, but when you're studying it, you look at the archaeology, you read the letters and the accounts, do you feel like this is a place that's completely different to the modern world, or do you feel this is a place which you could navigate through? If Aristotle walked into this room, he would sort of basically understand what was going on.
In many ways, a mix of both. I think depending on where you were, if you were on a battlefield, I think you could probably kind of move from one to the other, and because the ideas of battle, the tactics of battle may have changed, but if at the end of the day, the analysis of the goals are still the same. If you were sitting on the Pnyx in the political arena, would you understand what they were doing? Yes, you'd understand the process of debate and discourse that was leading to decision making. Would you be able to contribute to that? No, because you wouldn't be attuned to the importance and the cultural importances and different kind of sensitivities that were navigating and guiding that debate. If you were in a religious sanctuary, you'd be completely at sea. Here's a community that, when they were worshipping Dionysus at the city Dionysia, they spent a good day in a procession through the city, getting progressively more and more drunk and more into a state of ecstasy. And then when they got into the sanctuary, they'd then put themselves in the theatre for 3 days to watch 3 tragedies back to back, followed by a satyr play on each day. And then they'd pop out of that and sacrifice some animals to the gods, and then go on their merry way. And we wouldn't, I think, be able to get a handle on the ritual process that involves. So I think it's a real mix of both. Every time I study the ancient world, I'm fascinated by the way, on the one hand, very little seems to have changed. That humanity, its concerns, its interests, the way our minds work, very little has changed over 2,500 years. But on the other hand, of course, everything has changed, and that is going back to your question, is the way people look in the sweet shop of the ancient world. That is, I think, very much the crucial role that we need to play, that we need to make sure people are aware of just how vast and extraordinary this sweet shop is, how utterly crazy and bizarre and wonderful it is. But at the same time, help people understand that cherry picking from the sweet shop doesn't work, doesn't give you the right understanding of the ancient world. And it certainly doesn't do the ancient world justice, and it certainly doesn't do our world justice when you randomly pick some example from the ancient world and use it as a justification for what you want to do now. So our job, in those who study and engage with the ancient world, is to help people understand just how wonderful and amazing it is, but also educate people into how they should engage with it, how they should use it, and what value it can be to the world we live in today.
Brilliant. Dr. Marco Polo, thank you very much indeed.
It's a great pleasure.